Hello and welcome. This month the video is kind of split in two. The first bit I look at how problematic is really the issue of misinformation, disinformation and propaganda on social media, focus on the English language. And then I'm going to look at the results of the opinion polls conducted by the Levada Center in Russia. I decided to look a bit more into this study, which title is Propaganda and Misinformation on Facebook and Twitter during the Russian invasion of Ukraine. Links in the description below. It's a good paper in my opinion, and I can use the numbers that they've published to try to understand how big really the problem is, although the scope of the study was to see if propaganda and misinformation had increased since the beginning of the war. They cover a 4-month period from January to April of 2022. So I thought it was a good starting point to get a sense of how big the problem is with regards to fifth columnists, people injecting themselves into social media, English language specifically, to disseminate propaganda, Russian propaganda, misinformation or misleading information. Over 19 million posts in the selected database. It sounds good. However, we need to put this in perspective. We're talking about social media. So, for example, according to Facebook estimates, we have, and which I pulled from SenseHort.ai statistics for Facebook. Facebook has 2.7 billion active users daily, and they estimate that they get 3.63 billion posts daily. So these are huge numbers. But as I said, the researchers in the case, I would say, tried to get a representative slice of this huge pie. But let's make some pies of our own. So this is Facebook. Estimated daily users, 2.07 billion. And this is the number of interactions. And then we look at what the data used in the research is. So they take 0.05% of this huge pool of users, but they are unique users. And for this kind of volume of data, it is a fair amount. And if we look at the number of posts, i.e. we look at this post, the pool of posts, and how much this research takes, we can see it's a very small number. Again, I think it's a fair selection because of the huge numbers involved in social media, and because in the paper the researchers make clear how they selected it and how they chose. So I believe that they try their best to get a fair representation. So let's plot some numbers and make more pies. Right. These are just the numbers inside the research. So of all the posts that they've selected, only 1.43% overall were on topic. And these, the majority, over 50%, let's call it 52 to 53%, tended to present links to reliable sources of information. We have nearly 28 to 30%, let's call it that, shared links to unreliable sources of information. And then we have 18.36 that they just shared Russian propaganda. The paper explains how the links were classified. For example, anything coming from Russia Today was Russian propaganda. The interactions tell a different story though. The interactions following from the sharing of links to reliable sources of information are a lot higher than the interactions for example, propaganda. So links to propaganda may appear in people's newsfeed, but they don't tend to interact with it. They're, in my opinion, they're able to spot that this is perhaps not a reliable source of information. And that goes also for the posts that contain links to unreliable sources of information. But let's go back to the reach, because you can post whatever you want on social media, but the proof of the pudding, as the Brits say, is how far your post goes, how the amount of interactions it generates. And we can see that reliable does very well, in the sense that people are more comfortable in sharing posts or links that they consider reliable, or to sites that provide reliable information. Unreliable, bit lower, because also there is a matter of judgment. How do you decide that a news site is more reliable than another, or unreliable? So there is an element of judgment, so there is a bit of trial and error. The propaganda was clearly propaganda is, according to my numbers, 0.01%. People are not comfortable sharing propaganda, in the sense that first they recognize it's not reliable. They probably feel it promotes untruths, so they're not comfortable sharing. But, the argument could be that people don't use Facebook for news gathering or to follow the news necessarily. Interestingly, we can look at Twitter. Now, according to the stats from searchlogistics.com, again, links in the description below, Twitter has 619 million active users. And again, according to these sites, 48% of Twitter users are ex-users, which sounds wrong, use Twitter for news. So could be a bit more fertile ground to propagate misinformation, disinformation, etc. These numbers from Internet Live Stats. We're talking about nearly 200 billion tweets per year. So I took that and turned it into 4 months here. That's what it does. So we have the estimated tweets for 4 months and how much the researchers took, 0.37%. Again, when we're talking in terms of social media, this is okay for a research paper. They isolated links that were shared that were towards reliable source of information, unreliable, and propaganda. If you read the paper, which I encourage you to do, you may question why certain sites were chosen as more reliable than others, but overall, this is kind of exploratory, and we're using the numbers to get an idea of how actually people share and how they evaluate the information presented to them. So 71.62, let's call it 72%, were links, people shared links to reliable sources of information. There is less than 20% that peddled unreliable information, but Russian propaganda is quite low, in the sense that Twitter users or ex-users evaluate what comes in their feed and what they are prepared to share. It makes sense, because if you use Twitter for news, you probably have developed an ability to make a judgment call on what appears in your feed. So people are overall more comfortable sharing what they consider reliable information, reliable sources of information, than sites that they correctly identify as peddling propaganda and misinformation. Again, this is why I'm saying people that use Twitter for information gathering are probably familiar with links to not reliable news sources appearing in their feed, and they probably have developed a skill to identify them. Although Twitter is under some scrutiny, we can see that on Twitter, at least in the sample from this research, people are more willing to share links to reliable information rather than unreliable or just propaganda. I would say the difference between the Facebook numbers and the Twitter numbers, so these are percentages, by the way, it's to do with the fact that I assume people use Facebook a bit like I do. I use it to keep in touch, or to see or share what I'm doing, to see what my friends are doing. I don't necessarily rely on it for information. I use other sources for information or news gathering. All right. So why the hoo-ha? Clearly, fifth columnists are operating in the English language on social media, but their reach is not huge. It's fairly limited according to this research. So why the stress? Well, I think some of it is result of the recommender systems. By the way, Twitter has got this, links in the description below, has got a blog on how their recommender system works. It's very good. Most of it you know already, because if you use Twitter, you know at least intuitively how it works. The paper helps you formalize your knowledge. But fundamentally how it works, and this is oversimplified, it's what you see depends on your history, on your social media history. So it looks at what you're interested in and your social network. Then from your social networks, it selects the tweets with the most visibility, i.e. the one that were most successful in terms of likes, retweets, shares, etc. And that's one group. Then it looks at what you're interested in, and maybe goes outside your network and look at clusters that are interested in the same topics as you are. Then it goes through a lot of statistical models to whittle all this selection down, even goes through apparently a neural network to rank which tweets are more likely to interest you from which people, then goes through more statistical analysis, and in the end it mashes everything up with ads, suggestion for people you could follow, you might be interested in following, and then it spits it out in your timeline. It's a highly sophisticated system, and but the result is that you see what you have showed an interest in. So it may give the impression that a lot of people share your interests, which is not necessarily true, because everything you see on social media tends to be tailored to you. It's not representative of the whole world. And if you are a regular social media user, you know this. This is no surprise. Of course, this is important because the highlighting the presence of disrupting influences in social media is generally followed by calls to regulate social media. And this is my thinking, and it's my personal opinion. I am uneasy about regulating social media too much, because I remember when all the information you got was top managed. It wasn't a nice place to be. So every system has got its pitfalls, and to me the pitfalls of the old system are a lot worse than what I see on social media. But then again, it's what I see. You may feel differently. On a completely separate and unrelated note, I reread 1984 by George Orwell, third time for me. If you haven't read it, it's a love story. Winston, our main character, falls in love, but he lives in a dystopian world where citizens are monitored 24/7 and thinking is a crime. But I don't want to spoil it for you. It's an interesting read. Anyway, let's move on to the monthly stats for opinion polls conducted by the Levada Center. There has been a lot of talk about the Kirk's invasion. Ukrainians just went into Russian territory unopposed. And a lot of talk that this has had an effect, and we should be able to see it. Okay, the president's approval ratings. The median for the year is still going up, although it's got a little bit of a dip, we can see it here. And the same goes for the government, but the median is still going up. So although there is a dip, you can see there are regular dips. You can't just assume that this will continue. We'll see in the next months. This is still a lot higher than how people felt about President Putin back in 2020, 2021. And the government always trails a bit lower than the president, and they had a bit of a dip as well, but the median value for the year is still going up. Let's see how it goes. You can see here all the combined numbers. This is just monthly numbers, and this is median value for the year. Makes it easier to see that overall still going up. Okay. Assessment of the situation in the country. Of course, when you have your territory invaded by the country you started a war with, you can understand that this index should have gone down, and it did dip. But again, the median for the year is still going up. Consumer Sentiment Index and Social Sentiment Index. The Social Sentiment Index, as it says, it's more about how you feel in general, and the Consumer Sentiment Index, it's more focused on economics. And the Social Sentiment Index, the happy line is 100. I put them here together for simplicity, but really this index goes from 0 to 200. And people are still feeling reasonably happy. There has been a dip, but overall this number is still overall a bit higher than the leading up to the beginning of the war. But it'd be interesting if we can see a pattern emerging. I think it's early days, but anyway, I put the 3 months period ratings for June, August for 2024, 2023 and 2022, and the same for the government opinion polls and Russia moving in the right direction. Thank you so much for watching. I publish this type of video once a month, and during the week, on a weekly basis, hopefully, I publish videos of places I visit or things I find interesting, and those come in English, Italian and Bulgarian. Please like and subscribe, and have a lovely day. Bye bye.